What's up, guys? We are back with another fun, festive, and spooky video for you guys during the month of October. Or should I say, Apoctober. Those of you who were with us last year will remember the cosmic horror themed prompt list I made for the month of October in a vein similar to Smoggist or Mermaid. Last year's Apoctober was unique, however, in its inclusion of a fairly involved story that expanded beyond the month's drawing challenge. I had begun writing this story after moving to Providence, Rhode Island over a year ago, and I used the month of October as a means through which I could elaborate on certain plot points through singular illustrations of creatures, characters, and artifacts from the world of the story, the working title of which is now Benefit and Benevolent. Well, to my great delight and slight surprise, it seemed that a few of you guys really enjoyed where the story was headed, and all year long I was asked if I could continue it. Well, the time has come for me to once again dive into the city of Providence during the year 1923, and pick up where I had left off last year's prompts. Now, I feel like I should mention that last year's story was sort of the writer's equivalent of a rough sketch. I was improvising the plot day by day, trying to figure it out as I went. Now I've had over a year to reflect back on it, and I'll be using this month to fine-tune and adjust certain elements that I felt were somewhat underdeveloped in my first draft. You may notice changes and inconsistencies. These are intentional. I'm more or less starting from scratch, using the same characters and world to tell a somewhat different story, but hopefully you'll still enjoy it. Another key difference between this year and the last, as I'm sure some of you who have already been following my Instagram have noticed, I'm not forcing myself to create one piece every day. Instead, I'm prioritizing a much longer and more engaging written narrative, and creating illustrations of key characters to accompany this writing. Today's video will showcase the time-lapse footage of each of these pieces, but instead of focusing on my process, I will instead only be reading to you what I have written so far, so get ready for a story time. If at the end of the month you guys would still like to see a video exploring the technical side of each of my pieces, be sure to let me know and I'll whip that up for November. And while I myself am not following the prompt list that I made for this month, a lot of you guys are. I'll take some time every week to showcase some of my favorite pieces. Now that I've got that all explained, I don't want to waste any more time. This is going to be a long video, so get comfortable. Pull up a chair in front of a fire, or if you're like me and live in a tiny apartment, just light a candle and pretend you've got a chimney. Fill up a nice cup of hot apple cider, bundle in a cozy blanket, and let yourself be transported to the city of Providence, as it may have been well over a century ago. Part 1. At Benefit and Benevolent. By day, Benefit Street was a bustling hub of activity, connecting the campus of Brown University to the residences of both the students and the professors who taught there. This was a haven for the scholarly, the wealthy, and the elite. A buzz of conversation hung in the air, and there was a reliable, rhythmic clopping of horse hooves on cobblestone, followed by the subtle creaks and thuds of the carriages in tow behind them. Great manors walled in the street on either side, overlooking the city of Providence atop what was known as College Hill. On a busy day, one could easily avoid drawing attention to themselves, even in broad daylight, as the men and women trafficking the street were typically consumed by their various conversations. At night, however, Benefit Street transformed. A heavy snowfall that had started earlier that evening built up, undisturbed, blanketing the neighborhood in a thick white shroud of oppressive silence. The proud mansions that loomed tall over the trees blended together in the darkness, leaving one with the sensation of being trapped within some great valley of brick and timber. The street itself was desolate, the hum of so many voices absent and replaced with uncomfortable quiet. Only one set of footprints marred the snow's smooth surface, trailing behind a short, cloaked figure softly illuminated by a lantern clutched in her outstretched hand. Young Juno Mason was quite aware of the conspicuous nature of her outing as she continued down the sidewalk. Though the night was still, and the sound of her footsteps was muffled by the snow, she still had the sense that dozens of prying eyes were following her as she walked. Juno shivered and pulled her overcoat around her more tightly. She was not doing anything wrong, and she had not broken any law. She knew this, and yet it felt as if at any moment a man would jump from around a darkened corner, ranting about her misconduct and shouting for her arrest. Juno was familiar with how quickly the people of Benefit Street were to jump to unfair conclusions. She had experienced it firsthand. By their standards, a young black woman, alone on the streets in the middle of the night, was certainly more than enough cause for suspicion. Even under better circumstances, many times had she been accosted by the wealthy men and women who lived here, accusing her of petty thievery, eavesdropping, or some other unforgivable offense that made it clear to Juno that her presence on Benefit Street was perceived as a threat to their way of life. Of course, she had never been guilty of any such crime. Juno was terrified of the law, or more accurately, of the people who upheld it. She had never so much as cut in line at the farmer's market, out of fear of being reprimanded. This alibi was never accepted, and it was quite likely that, on several occasions, she would have been arrested in spite of her innocence had it not been for the interference of her employer, Professor Richard Dorr. Juno served as a housekeeper for Dorr, and while many of the wealthy families who employed help actively avoided any sort of personal interaction with them, Dorr seemed to care deeply for the well-being and protection of Juno. He had even put his own reputation on the line for her before, though he had far less to lose from doing so than she did. The testimony of a white man, Juno had learned, whether or not it was the truth, would always be more credible than her own. But now, Professor Dorr would not be here to vouch for her. He could not guarantee her safety, for in fact it was out of concern for the safety of Professor Dorr that Juno had put herself in such a vulnerable position. But it was just a dream, she thought to herself. He's not really in any danger. She repeated this in her mind over and over again as she walked, but had not yet been able to convince herself that this was the truth. She shivered again, and struggled once more to tighten her coat. She did not feel cold. Why could she not stop shivering? A huge crash echoed through the night sky. A flash of white light illuminated the street, and Juno leapt, clutching tightly to her lantern and making every effort not to shriek. Her first reaction was to think that she had been caught, and maybe even fired upon, by one of the many residents of Benefit Street. As she stood there, frozen in place and once again cloaked by the dark and stillness, she realized what the sound must have been. Lightning? She whispered to herself. Thunder and lightning. During a snowstorm? The quiet night no longer felt still. Juno's heart was pounding so loudly that she was sure everyone on the street would be able to hear it. It must be shaking their beds, she thought, as she watched the lantern in her hand tremble violently with every loud thump. The wind had started to pick up, blowing the falling snow back up into her face. Nevertheless, she continued onward. What had started as paranoia was now transforming into legitimate fear. As the storm whipped up, growing more intense with every numbing step, she contemplated the journey back home. She had been walking for over an hour, forcing herself carefully through the deep snow. Now she would have to face the return trip alone, through what was steadily becoming the strangest weather she had ever experienced. The thought of turning around tugged at the back of her mind, but she ignored the temptation. She was nearly there. After several more minutes of dragging her thin boots through what was now well over a foot of snow, her lantern caught a sign in its light. Benevolent Street, the sign read, and Juno turned to look up at the road that ran perpendicular to and intersected Benefit. There, on the left side of the road and overlooking the steep hill that sloped downward and vanished into the night, stood Dorr Manor. By daylight, the house was easy to identify, for it looked distinctly miskept compared to the many other mansions of Benefit Street, yet it was still several times larger and many times more prestigious than anything Juno had ever lived in. It had 3 stories, all wrapped in darkness except for a single brave light on the very top floor, which was shining warmly out of a large circular window. Good, Juno thought to herself. He's home, at least. Professor Dorr had a habit of disappearing on mysterious leaves of absence, unannounced for several days and sometimes weeks at a time. Upon his eventual return, it became clear that wherever he had gone was not only exotic and foreign, but also extremely dangerous. This was evident in the many bizarre tokens and souvenirs that he would bring home with him, which Juno thoroughly enjoyed, as well as several new injuries and maladies, which she did not enjoy nearly as much. It was this sort of erratic behavior that had Juno constantly worrying about the safety of the professor, But on this night more than most, she could not shake the particularly frightening notion that something horrible had happened to him. She hung her lantern on the hook outside the front door. She knocked, gently at first, not wishing to startle the professor or raise suspicion throughout the neighborhood. But after eliciting several moments of only silence in response, Juno concluded that the ever-worsening storm had probably rendered the sound of anything softer than a falling tree inaudible. She knocked again, more heavily this time. She had never made this much noise for as long as she could remember. "Professor Dorr? It's me, Miss Mason." She paused, hoping to hear some response before reluctantly forcing herself to shout. "Professor Dorr? I know it's late, but I need to speak to you." She startled herself with the power of her voice. She could not recall the last time she had ever yelled. Juno fumbled around in her waistcoat, willing her now frostbitten fingers to clench around a ring of assorted keys that hung from a loop within. She sorted through them, her frozen hands trembling, thin wisps of vapor escaping from her mouth as her ragged breath shortened. Finally, she had the right key. Though she had done it 1,000 times before, she struggled to fit the key into the lock. Between the lack of feeling in her fingers, the storm that was still somehow growing more terrible by the minute, and the frantic, thunderous racing of her heart, Juno found it quite difficult to accomplish this task. As the lock clicked, another flash of lightning split the sky, and a second later thunder followed with such intensity that the windows of the Dorr Manor rattled in their frames. This time, Juno could not control herself. She leapt, letting out a piercing shriek that only lasted a moment before she forced her lips sealed once again. She did not bother to check if anyone could hear her. She hastily grabbed the lantern from its hook outside the door, threw the door open, and flung herself inside. She had hoped it would be a little warmer in here, but at least the wind had stopped. Juno lifted her lantern again, her hands shaking worse than ever now, and surveyed the foyer. It was completely dark, and the light coming from her storm-battered lantern revealed little. Fortunately, she knew this house inside and out. She probably could have navigated it blindfolded if she had to, but she elected instead to keep her lantern held high. "Professor Dorr?" she called again. No response. For a moment, she thought she heard the sound of several voices coming from upstairs. They were soft, but they reverberated throughout the house in such a way that she was sure she could not be imagining them. She moved slowly across the foyer, towards the first flight of stairs that winded up in an elegant spiral to the second floor. She looked up at the chandelier that she knew hung above her, though she could not see it through the gloom. Juno took another step towards the stairs. Then the voices seemed to fade. She strained her ears, but all she could hear now was the wind howling against the old house and the groaning, unrelenting rumble of thunder that surely must be nearing a crescendo. Crack! Another flash of lightning lit up the entirety of the house, filling the room with an eerie white glow for only a moment. In that instant, Juno was able to see the familiar foyer, the elaborate oriental rug that lay folded and torn at its edges, the shelves lined with glass cases displaying all manners of strange flora and fauna, the splendid cast-iron chandelier, dripping with solidified wax and swaying menacingly as the house trembled against the wind. And in front of her, the full set of 14th century German knights' armor that stood guard at the foot of the stairs. Juno saw these objects every day while she worked keeping house for Professor Dorr. She had always found them intriguing, even comforting. But in that one horrible second, surrounded on all sides by strange objects lit in a harsh, unearthly white light, Juno suddenly felt as if at any moment the house could spring to life and attack her. Darkness fell once again, and the eccentric decorations of Professor Dorr melted back into the shadows. Juno quickened her pace, her lantern now swinging slightly as she hurried up the first flight of stairs. "Professor Dorr?" she called again, more aggressively. By now he must surely hear her. Why was he not responding? "Professor, it's me, Juno. Do you have company?" Still no response. A thud echoed from somewhere above her, followed by a clatter as if something fragile had shattered. Suddenly, a wave of terror washed over Juno, causing her to stop dead in her tracks. At once, a million different horrible thoughts started to spiral in her head, each a more morbid explanation for the crashing sound than the last. Burglars, she thought to herself. They've reached his study and are ransacking his valuables. Then another thought. His heart! Professor Dorr was incredibly old, and more than once Juno had arrived at his house to find him unconscious on the floor. Perhaps he had collapsed again, only this time he had struck his head on one of his many curiosities. Juno imagined reaching the door to his study and finding him lying there in a pool of blood, shards of glass everywhere, and his collection of ancient Chinese militia arms sprouting from his back. For another moment she stood there, paralyzed by her racing imagination. Her lantern continued to sway from its handle, clutched firmly in Juno's fist. It cast its yellow light back and forth along the walls of the hallway, illuminating briefly the many portraits of the other members of the prestigious Dorr family. Their eyes seemed to meet Juno's as she stared briefly up at them, as if expecting one of them to reassure her that her fears were nothing but senseless paranoia. Instead, she felt as if she was in front of a jury, every member of which had already reached their verdict. She gulped and attempted to steady her breath. If Professor Dorr was dead, and Juno was the first person to find him, she would be accused of murder. There was no doubt in her mind. The moment the police arrived, they would ask what she had been doing at the professor's house, without his knowing and off her shift, in the middle of the night. All of the fears and suspicions of those people living on Benefit Street would be validated. It would turn out that this ne'er-do-well girl in which the poor professor had placed his trust was nothing less than a cold-blooded murderer, and her punishment would surely be... Another crack of thunder shook Juno from her trance. She was still in the hallway, though she had moved some several feet towards the next flight of stairs. Taking in reality once again, she found herself somewhat calmer than before. These people, these wealthy, entitled sods that had judged her for every step she took, would not have her fearing her own thoughts. Of all the things she was uncertain of tonight, one thing she knew for sure, that she was not a murderer. At any rate, Professor Dorr's life was far more important in this moment than her own reputation. If he is still alive, there's no time to waste standing frozen in fear imagining what could or couldn't be. There may still be time to save him. She began climbing the final flight of stairs. Thud, thud, thud. With every step, her resolve faltered, then returned. He's dead. Thud. He'll be fine. Thud. I'm going to be hanged. Thud. I can still save him. Finally, she reached the double doors that stood tall at the end of the stairs. She could see light from a fire glowing from behind the closed doors, and a comforting warmth overwhelmed her. She heard no more commotion, no more voices. Juno seemed to detect a slight rustle of paper and the familiar sound of clinking china. Were her fears really all in her head? Could this all have been a result of some misplaced paranoia? She outstretched a hand and knocked softly on the door. Professor? Are you in there? The unmistakable sound of a teacup being placed gently back onto its plate could be heard in response to these words. She recognized the signature groan of the professor that he always made as he hoisted himself up from his massive lounge chair, and the creak of his footsteps as he approached the door. Juno let out a shaky sigh of relief. It had all been a figment of her imagination. The light that had been leaking out from the seam in the double doors spilled over Juno as they opened slowly, revealing the warmly lit room inside. Before her, standing in silhouette against the light of the room, his arms still resting on the double doors, stood Juno's employer. Professor Richard Dorr was one of the oldest and most well-known residents of Benefit Street, and perhaps all of Providence. He had been teaching at Brown University for over 40 years, covering a wide number of subjects during his tenure. Juno guessed that in his younger years he would have been a handsome man. Alas, his looks had faded in his old age, alongside his reputation. Dorr first lost popularity with the people of Providence when he supported the efforts of abolitionists during the Civil War. He began teaching off the curriculum in his political science classes at Brown, attempting to educate his students on the dark history of the school and the role that it played in the slave trade. It was this notoriety that first intrigued Juno about the professor, and it was around this time that she had begun working for him when she was just 14 years old. After being removed from the political science department, Dorr began instructing a world history class instead, sharing his experiences traveling around the globe. These classes helped repair his community standing somewhat. Students fought for spots in his class just to hear his stories and witness firsthand his many exotic artifacts. This all changed when the professor ejected a troublemaking student from his class for disrespectfully donning and parading around in a Lakota headdress that Dorr had received as a gift from one of their chiefs. The student was a son of a fairly influential lawmaker in Providence, and Dorr nearly lost his job once word had spread that he had quite literally kicked the boy out of the room. In his last few years at Brown, he taught a fairly unpopular zoology class that had students running odd jobs for local farms and even caring for Dorr's own exotic collection of pets. At this point, the community had all but shunned Dorr from their inner circles, and most people refused to even acknowledge him on the streets. His immense wealth and undeniable intelligence ensured that he was still respected at least on a social level, but in effect, he was no more welcome among the ranks of the elite on Benefit Street than Juno was. It was this connection that helped forge their unique relationship. Not only did they share a passion for exploration, discovery, and uncovering the mysteries of the world, but they were both victims, to different degrees, of a toxic political and social structure that aimed to elevate the privileges of a small group of individuals at the expense of anyone who did not share their worldview. The professor smiled as his eyes met Juno. His arms slid down the edges of the door as he slowly extended a hand towards her. "Can I take that lantern from you, or would I require an ice pick to chisel it from your fingers?" Juno became suddenly aware of how tightly she had been clutching the ring from which the lantern hung. Her knuckles were strained and frostbitten, and against the heat issuing from inside the study, she realized just how cold the wrought iron had become. She thought for a moment that she would in fact require some manner of sharp tool to break her grip around the thing, but slowly her hand relaxed, and she offered the lantern to Dorr. He took it from her, and gestured with his other hand to enter the room. She followed him slowly, instinctively closing the double doors behind her so that the warmth from the fire would not escape the study. Though she had been in this room hundreds of times, it was impossible not to gaze around, taking in every detail of what must surely be the most fascinating place in the whole city. The professor's study was where he spent most of his time when he was home. It was the most well-kept room in the house, and Juno thought that if Dorr had put even half as much care and attention towards the rest of the manor as he did his study, it would be the most magnificent home in all of Providence. The ceiling was high, over 18 feet, and slanted downwards on one side. About a foot below where the slanted roof met the wall protruded a singular shelf that ran from one corner of the room to the other. On it sat dozens of assorted artifacts, books, and preserved specimens, similar to those found on the foyer downstairs. On the side of the room where the ceiling was the highest sat a proud brick fireplace. Several logs blazed from within, flooding the room with a warm orange light. On the mantel above sat yet more curiosities, including a large ornate dagger and a delicate taxidermied owl. Mounted on the brick chimney above was the head of some massive deer, larger than anything Juno had ever seen or heard of. Its antlers stretched like bony claws downwards towards the floor, as if just before the beast had died it had been reaching out to grab something with them. In front of the fire, atop another elegant oriental rug, were two massive armchairs and an elaborately carved side table. Juno was the only other person aside from the professor who had sat in these chairs, as far as she was aware. Yet for all these years he had kept them both, as if he was waiting for some distinguished guest to arrive and hold counsel with him before the flames. At the far end of the room, before a large circular window, was the professor's desk. It was enormous, almost 4 feet tall and well over 8 feet long. It was outfitted with all manners of drawers, cabinets, and hidden compartments. Juno knew these well, as it was her job to keep them clean and functional. Stacked high on the surface of the desk were several thick tomes, bound with leather and steel braces, and embellished with silver and gold lettering. These books were not to be handled by Juno at the professor's behest. They were kept sealed by large metal padlocks that clamped around the book's covers. There were a few things that one would normally find on the desk of a college professor: an inkwell, several sheets of scattered paper, and various other draftsman tools such as protractors and compasses. But there were also some things that Juno guessed that no other person in the world would keep on display. Most prominent was an upright glass terrarium that contained several bits of twigs and a strange twisting plant that never flowered. Crawling along the stem of the plant were two shining beetles, one gold and the other a shimmering deep metallic blue. As far as Juno knew, these beetles were never fed, never taken out of the glass, and never died. Yet they scuttled persistently back and forth along the branches within their ornamental prison, never seeming to tire or rest. There was also some strange mechanism unlike Juno had ever seen. It looked to be something between an astrolabe and a set of scales. with a series of concentric metal rings rotating at different speeds set above a complicated device with two mechanized arms that seemed to lift up and down in response to the movement of the rings. At this moment, the rings were spinning faster than Juno had ever seen them before, and both arms were stretched up to their limit. Above the room loomed a skeleton of an ancient beast that the professor said once roamed the seas some 40 million years ago. It had a long, serpentine body that spiraled downward so that the tip of its tail hung suspended in midair about 10 feet from the ground. The shadows it cast as the light from both the fireplace and the many candles lit throughout the room shifted slightly on the ceiling as the thing rocked back and forth gently with the shaking of the house. The professor pulled one of the massive armchairs out from in front of the fire and beckoned Juno to sit. She did so, almost unconsciously, as she did at the end of any casual day working at the Door Manor. She half expected to look out and see the sun setting behind the panes of the circular window at the far end of the room, but outside was nothing but pitch darkness and the howling of the storm. It seemed much farther away now. Surely it would pass soon. "I couldn't interest you in a cup of coffee, could I?" asked the professor. "I know it's late, but this blend is the absolute best thing for staving off the cold. Got it from a trip down to Central America. Chili and cacao powder mixed in with the beans. I guarantee you've had nothing like it before." Juno smiled. "I'll guarantee you that I have. You offered me some last week." The professor stared vacantly ahead as he filled a small cup with dark black coffee. "Oh yes, so I did," he said finally, lifting up the kettle and holding the cup to Juno. "And remind me, you liked it, yes?" Juno couldn't help but chuckle. She took the cup in her hands and sipped. At once a fiery warmth spread from the back of her tongue all the way to her stomach. The heat radiating from the cup seemed to melt the cold off her fingers, and feeling slowly returned to them. She shivered again, as if shaking off some physical burden that had been weighing her down. "I like it now," she answered after taking another sip. "Wait until tomorrow morning," the professor replied, pouring himself a cup and sitting down in the chair next to her. "This stuff will flow through your system like hot magma to the sea. A cup a day and you'll be so regular you could keep time by your bowel movements." Juno looked at her cup apprehensively, shrugged, and took another sip. Within a few moments she had finished it all, and set her cup down on the table next to her. She moved to take off her coat, and realized that melted snow had dripped all over the leather cushions of her armchair and pooled on the rug below her. "Oh, no, Professor, I'm sorry. I didn't think to hang up my outerwear before coming up here. I'll go fetch a towel." Dor waved his hand dismissively as he finished a sip from his cup. "Don't be ridiculous. Sit, it's only water. Worse things will spill on this old rug before I decide to throw the thing out." He motioned to Juno to return to her seat. "At least let me hang up my coat by the fire, sir. There need not be any further damage to your chairs." "Of course," chortled Dor, "as if you need my permission to remove wet clothes. You haven't eaten since I last instructed you, I expect." He laughed sarcastically as Juno moved to drape her coat over the mantel. She stayed by the fire for a moment, allowing the heat to nearly burn her toes as it rapidly dried her soggy boots. Behind her, the professor fidgeted with his teacup, clinking it against his plate somewhat more than he needed to. Juno continued to stare at the fire. There was a reason she came here. What was it? The last few minutes seemed to have drained every thought, every emotion that she had entered the room with, and replaced them with what felt like some sort of feigned comfort. She turned around suddenly. "What was the noise I heard? Before, when I entered the house? It sounded like people talking. Voices. Then there was a thud, something breaking. What happened up here, sir?" The professor stared at Juno hard. He had a look of concerned anticipation on his face, in a way that a parent watches their child when they know they're about to do something dangerous. He stopped clinking his cup and placed the plate down on the table beside Juno's. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together and resting between his knees. Juno got the impression that he was choosing his next words very carefully. "Why do you still call me Sir, Juno?" he asked quietly. Juno was taken aback by the question. She opened her mouth to respond, and then shook her head. "No, not this time. I know what you're doing. I won't fall for it again, sir." Dor leaned back in his chair, his hands still together and now resting on his chest. "My name is Richard, but most people like to call me Dick. You know, some people call me that even though I'm sure they don't know my name. Why do you think? Juno locked eyes with the professor. She glared at him so intensely that he stopped speaking mid-sentence. He raised his eyebrows, looking somewhat amused. Don't do this, Dick. Juno was sure to emphasize the name. Don't try and distract me. I asked you a question. What was all that noise I heard up here? She hastened to his chair and pulled the cup of coffee away before he could reach it, holding it in front of him. No stalling. I came here in the dead of night through the worst snowstorm Providence has ever seen because I had a dream that you had been abducted and killed by something. It felt too real to have just been a nightmare, too real to just be paranoia. Now I come to your house and I hear all sorts of strange commotions and weird voices and... Professor Dorr put a hand on Juno's shoulder. He was standing now, only a few inches taller than she. She glanced at his withered hand, pale and gnarled. She looked up into his eyes. They were staring deep into hers, glassy and quivering. He looked as if there were some great secret welling up just behind his eyes, trying desperately to escape through his mouth. His mustache trembled, like he was about to speak, but he licked his lips quickly and cleared his throat instead. He retracted the hand from Juno's shoulder and straightened out his jacket. Juno noticed that it was damaged in some places, like it had been caught on the corner of a sharp table and torn. She looked again to meet his eyes, but now he was looking past her, towards the fire. I'm an old man, Juno, he said at last, slowly drifting away from her. At one point in my life, I could scale a mountain with a 40-pound knapsack strapped to my back. Now I find myself dropping dinnerware as my hands shake under their weight. He outstretched an arm and propped himself against the brick of the fireplace, staring into the flames. Juno recognized this way of talking. This is how the professor answered tricky questions without lying. He would list off a few things that were in fact true, only pertaining to the subject at hand, without actually addressing whatever issue had been brought up. It often worked on stupider people, and Juno couldn't help but feel somewhat insulted that he was deflecting her in this way. But she also knew that there was very little that the professor would be unwilling to share with her, and she slowly accepted the fact that whatever it was that happened to make the noises, he was not comfortable with Juno knowing about it. Maybe he had really dropped a plate, and felt embarrassed about it. He had certainly done it before, and on every occasion tried to cover it up so that she would not know. His mind was slipping more and more every day, Juno had noticed, more so than most people his age. Sometimes she even caught him mumbling to himself, even overhearing full conversations that sounded like he was addressing a class full of students, but was merely the professor using multiple voices to answer his own questions. This did quite explain everything she had heard, and she suddenly felt very bad for forcing him to answer the question. She turned again and joined him by the fire. He was still staring intently at the flames, their yellow light dancing off of his green eyes. I'm sorry, sir, she said quietly. I didn't mean to pry. It was this crazy dream, I think. It had me feeling like you were in some terrible danger. Truth be told, I'm just glad you're okay. Dorr turned his head to look at her. His face creased into a weak smile, but there was still worry in his eyes. Dreams have a funny way of telling us the truths our waking minds are so good at ignoring, he said, staring deep into Juno's eyes again. I'm very lucky to have someone in my life who cares so much about me, even now, even after what I've become. These last words sounded strange to Juno. She assumed that he was referring to how he was perceived in the eyes of his peers, or maybe he meant that he was a different man in his old age. But something about the way he had said it made Juno think that he was hiding information from her. He straightened up, breaking eye contact with Juno once again and fidgeting with his jacket. It's late, child, and while I deeply appreciate your worries and your efforts concerning my well-being, you should really be at home. After all, I believe there is someone who demands your attention far more than I. Looking knowingly at Juno out of the corner of his eye. How? What do you mean? She stammered, trying to sound confident and not nearly as caught off guard as she felt. A young baby's health and nurture should be valued over that of a decrepit old man, don't you think? And with this, he pulled out his checkbook and pen from within a coat pocket and started scribbling. No, sir, Professor, Richard, It's all right, he interjected. Your secret is safe with me. My only hope is that the poor girl's father will find it within himself to return to her and her mother before long. I've got a mind to go find the lad and beat some sense into him myself. Juno stared at Dor with her mouth open. How did he know about her daughter? She had been so careful to conceal herself during her pregnancy, though it had been easy in the final months, as the cold weather gave her a great excuse to dress in heavy, baggy clothes. This aside, even if he had noticed, who told him about the father? She had not said a word. She had never so much as mentioned that she had been with a man. In truth, there was not a soul she could think of that she had told about the entire situation. Professor Dor finished writing the check. "Here," he said, tearing the check from the book and handing it to Juno. "Let's call it a late Christmas bonus. I'm sure you could use it right now. And please let me know if you ever need time off to take care of the child. I'm not sure when you found time to deliver the kid without missing a shift." He chuckled, offering the check to Juno. She continued to stare, transfixed on the professor's face, which was now beaming at her brightly. Her eyes moved to examine the check. $500? She exclaimed. "Professor, this is far too much. I don't make this much in a year." "Don't you?" Dor tilted his head, confused. "Well, we've got to do something about that. You've got 2 mouths to feed now." He patted Juno on the shoulder and started guiding her towards the door. She pushed him away. "No, sir, I mean it. This is too much. People will ask questions. How would someone like me happen upon so much money in such little time?" She was so overwhelmed with everything that had happened, her knees felt weak. "Just tell him the truth. You're mad as a hatter. Boss gave them to you. And if they have any problem with that, you can just tell him to go talk to me." He was speaking loudly now, as if he was trying very hard to keep her attention on him. Juno was clutching the check in both hands, staring at the elegant 500 that sprawled across the paper in striking black ink. With this much money she could afford a bigger apartment, a separate room for the baby, no more roommates coming and going, no more landlord banging at the door asking for rent. And her baby could have her own clothes. Not just one set, but a whole wardrobe. Maybe even outfits for every season. They were at the doors now, the professor holding one ajar and gesturing out towards the stairs. "If you like," he said, snapping Juno out of her trance. "I can wake my stable boy and have him hitch a carriage for your ride home. That storm sounds dreadful out there." Juno hesitated. The storm did not feel so scary anymore. She felt as if she could ride this check home like a magic carpet through the night sky. She gazed up at the professor. "I'll manage, sir," she said at last, still mystified. "And, sir," she started as the professor handed her her lantern, "thank you. You don't know how much this will help me." The professor smiled. "Why do you still call me sir, Juno?" he asked for the second time. Juno returned the smile. "Thank you, Richard." The two continued to smile at one another as the professor slowly closed the door. As darkness once again surrounded Juno, she felt lighter and more invigorated than she had in months. She ignited her lantern and turned back to pace down the stairs. She was filled with so much warmth, so optimistic for the future, that it took until she was right at the front door before she realized she'd left her coat in the professor's study. She chuckled to herself and headed back up the stairs. All the way she kept examining the check by the light of her lantern. If so many other strange things had not happened tonight, she might believe this to also be a figment of her imagination. But there it was, clutched in her hand, a check for $500. She was so lost in her fantasies of what she would do with her money that she forgot to knock as she re-entered the study at the top of the stairs. "Hey, Dick, I assume that I don't need your permission, but is it all right with you if I wear my coat back home?" She smiled as she looked up from the check. The ring of her lantern slid from her hand and thudded onto the floor, clanging loudly. The skeleton of the massive sea beast was shaking wildly as the wind tugged at the wire suspending it from the ceiling. The shadows it cast as it waved from side to side seemed to move like so many loosed bats fluttering around the room. The fire danced menacingly, flickering in the direction of the frigid air that was blowing in through the shattered, circular window on the far side of the room, and embers mixed with snow in a spiral above the center of the room. The check floated lightly out of Juno's grip as her arms fell to her side. It was picked up by the draft, pulled across the floor, and caught momentarily on the many shards of glass that littered the study. Finally, it rested and sank into a puddle of scarlet spreading over the rug. There, beneath the swirls of yellow and white twisting in the wind, obscured by the ominous shadows of the swaying bones, and mirrored in a pool of his own blood, lay the body of Professor Richard Dorr. Part 2. The Providence Cavalry. You're funning me. Through the top window? Yup, clear through the center. Shattered the glass and everything. Two voices echoed through the morning mist, uninterrupted by any other sound. It was early, just a few minutes past 6, and Benefit Street was deserted. The dreamlike fog that hung over the city of Providence obscured everything behind a veil of wispy vapor, and it was hard to distinguish the figures of two young boys walking side by side along the road. Teddy Gramble liked it this way, for it made things much easier for him and his friend to complete their daily routine without being interrupted by meddling adults. Teddy's voice carried farther and was much clearer heard, and as he led his small friend, whom he called Twiggy, down the sidewalk, it was apparent which of the two of them was in charge. "I'm gonna have to see this for myself, Bull," said Twiggy, gazing up at his companion with dubious excitement. "Where do you think I'm taking you? Come on, it's on our way," replied Teddy. Twiggy had always admired Teddy, though he never called him by his real name. Teddy had never revealed it to his closest friend, instead preferring to be called the Bull. In fact, no one save for Teddy's parents knew him by anything other than this nickname, and this is how he preferred it. Though only 9 years old, Teddy had elected to emancipate himself from the care of his biological father and make his own way in the world. He had never really considered the man who raised him to be a father, rather more like a snarling guard dog that would neither allow him to leave his sight, nor was ever happy with the boy around. Teddy's mother had died less than an hour after giving birth to him, or so he had been told by his father, and only after naming him Teddy. Teddy's father held his son responsible for his wife's death, and was quite transparent about this for as long as the boy had been alive. The name Teddy caused his father to wince, and he violently insisted that he not be called by it. It reminded his father of her every time he heard the name. Over the years, Teddy began to flinch at the sound of his own name as well, so he too abandoned it along with other memories of his mother, and came up with a nickname that he thought would make him feel strong enough to take on even his brutish dad. Now, of course, he had made things simpler by cutting the man out of his life completely, forcing himself into a position of responsibility and self-awareness that most people don't achieve until they are well into adulthood. Still, his identity as the Bull seemed to give him the strength to continue along his reckless path, and hearing it spoken by the people who cared for him and respected him was nourishing for his soul. They had now reached a corner where two roads intersected one another. Looking up, Teddy recognized the signs that read Benefit Street and Benevolent Street, though he could not actually understand the written words. One drawback from living alone as a 9-year-old without any adults to care for him was that he had not continued any form of standardized education. This hardly seemed to matter, though, as this occasion proved to him once again. He didn't need book smarts as long as he could understand the world he lived in well enough to keep him alive. Twiggy let out a low whistle beside him. Hidden in the veil of autumn mist stood what had once surely been a gorgeous mansion. 3 stories tall, with stairs leading up to an elaborately decorated front door, sealed tightly behind a shining silver padlock that seemed rather well maintained in comparison to the rest of the property. Siding was rotting off the front of the house, with bits of it missing and scattered along the overgrown patch of yard out front. Vines grew out of the grass and wound their way up the sides, giving the impression that at any moment the place may be pulled down into the earth by the thick tentacles of green. The windows were almost completely shattered. Only the highest ones seemed to still be mostly intact. One window on the 3rd floor, however, had not been spared. Sitting in the very middle of the uppermost floor, a large circular window, quite unlike anything on any other building in the neighborhood, was shattered like the rest of them. "There you have it," said the Bull as he and Twiggy crossed the street to the abandoned house on the other side. "Top floor, circle window. Smashed it to bits. Not bad, huh?" Twiggy stared upwards, his neck not quite able to bend back far enough to see up to the 3rd floor. Twiggy was somewhat shorter than the Bull, and a fair deal scrawnier. Like his friend, Twiggy was also an orphan, but not by choice. He had never known his parents, and spent his 9 years of life bouncing from orphanage to orphanage, unable to ever find a permanent home. He met the bull 2 years ago and instantly admired his disregard for the limitations set by adults that he had always assumed were mandatory for all children. Moreover, he felt like the bull was more responsible and far more in control of his life than any adult he had ever known. It was this mixture of a desire to become him and a desire to be raised by him that led Twiggy to develop an unbreakable attachment to the boy, and though it was true that Twiggy was actually a few months older than the bull, he had nevertheless become something like a little brother to him. "I just can't believe it," said Twiggy after accepting that he could not quite see the window from here. "I mean, how did you do it? I can't even hit it with my slingshot from here, and we're standing right next to it." "That's just it," said the bull knowingly. "Trying to hit a window on the 3rd floor from the ground directly below it would be near impossible. That's why I hit it." He paused and turned around, pointing. "From up there." Twiggy turned to see where the bull was pointing. Across the street, hidden too in the fog that hung low all around them, loomed the shadow of another building, even larger than the mansion in front of which the two boys stood. "The Hope Club?" gasped Twiggy. "But how'd you get up there? I heard they got these big old dogs that chase off anyone who ain't supposed to be there, non-members and stuff." "You're damn right," replied the bull, who knew this was not the case whatsoever. "That's why I had to be sneaky about it. You see, what I did was..." "He's lying," sang a high, peppy voice from somewhere in the mist. The two boys spun around, their eyes darting back and forth. Twiggy pulled a slingshot out of his pocket and, forgetting to load anything into it, drew back the band in a very non-threatening way. From out of the mist to their right, a figure was emerging. It was about the same height as they were, yet almost twice as large. It seemed to have an enormous, frilly head, like the mane of some manicured lion, and was approaching them slowly. The two boys took a step backwards in fear. Suddenly, the bull relaxed. He rolled his eyes, leaned back a bit, and chuckled. Twiggy looked up at him, trying to decide if it was all right for him to lower his guard as well. "Jeez, Dot, don't do that. We can't see a thing this early in the morning. We thought you were someone's mama coming to give us what's for," laughed the bull. As the figure got closer to them, it became clear to Twiggy why the bull had laughed. It was not a lion at all, far from it. It was a 9-year-old girl, Dorothy Shine, carrying her trademark parasol in spite of the incessant fog. Dorothy was a friend of the boys, though she could not be more different from the two. She not only knew both her parents, but got along with them very well. Her father was a well-known employee of the city bank, her mother an established high-class socialite. Needless to say, whereas Twiggy and the bull often wondered when their next meal would be, Dorothy had more luxuries and amenities in her life than most. Nevertheless, she did not look down on the two boys. On the contrary, she respected them quite a bit, and while she was not permitted by either parents to have any contact with them, she often made time to sneak away from home and hang out with the two, finding their antics both amusing and genuinely exciting. The three had taken to calling themselves the Providence Cavalry, and made it their personal mission to explore every inch of the city. Dorothy stepped lightly up to them, twirling her parasol and grinning with her lips sealed tight, like she was trying desperately to contain a laugh. "Someone's mama? Oh, come now, Bull. How many mothers do you know who are 4 feet tall?" she retorted in a sarcastic tone. "Can't say I know a lot of mamas at all, to be honest with you," replied the bull, still smiling. "But I imagine they sound like you. High-pitched voice and talking all proper and stuff." Dorothy was standing in front of them now, gazing up at the building with the broken windows. She gave a scrutinizing look at the house, as if she was a police officer just called to the scene of a murder, and twirled her parasol in thought. "So, you broke the window, eh, Bull?" she said, a mock tone of curiosity in her voice. "Very impressive, if it were true." The bull blushed. Of all the people he knew, Dorothy was undoubtedly the smartest. He would have kept all of this about the window secret from her if he could have helped it, but he had a feeling now that he knew what would happen next. "You think I'm lying, huh?" he asked defensively. "What makes you say that?" "Well, first of all," replied Dorothy, giggling, "my daddy always says that an innocent man, when confronted about a crime, will provide a defense first, see? And a guilty man will always ask for proof." She twirled her parasol again, rocking back and forth on the balls of her feet, clearly quite pleased with herself. I've simply presented the possibility that you might be lying about the window, and yet your first response was to challenge me on my evidence for the claim. As if we've already established that what you've said was a lie, and now you're just struggling to find a technicality through which you can escape with your reputation untainted. She glanced down at Twiggy, who looked thoroughly confused. The bull's head was spinning. He found that he was having a hard time fully comprehending what Dorothy had just said to him, but he knew that whatever it meant, he was being outed. He looked down at his feet and caught Twiggy trying to meet his eyes as he glanced to his side. He straightened himself up, tightening the string that hung around his neck, suspending a large mask in the shape of a bull's head on his back. He cleared his throat. I didn't mean to come off as, defensive, he said, trying to sound calm. This is a big deal, you see. It took me a heck of a long time getting up that hill onto the roof of the Hope Club, and to break the window clear through on my first throw. Now that you mention it, though, interrupted Dorothy, I do have some proof that you didn't break the window. The bull froze. You can see it, can't you? Look up, huh? There it is. The window's smashed. Look! He reached down and grabbed a shard of broken glass off the sidewalk. He waved it in Dorothy's face. Don't need much more proof than that, do you? He threw the piece of glass down at the ground and folded his arms confidently. Twiggy, who had been watching him closely, mimicked his attitude and folded his arms as well, satisfied that this settled the matter. Dorothy tilted her head and smiled even more broadly, as if she had been waiting for him to say this. Oh, the window's broken. There's no denying that. But it wasn't you throwing a rock that did it. Before she finished her sentence, the bull had opened his mouth to interrupt, but at these last words, he closed it again. How did you know that? He stammered, now finding it difficult to remain composed. Because it's been broken, Dorothy started. For over 53 years, finished another voice. Now, all three of the children were thoroughly confused. With a sudden realization hitting all of them at once, a look of panic spread across their faces. It was an adult's voice. Twiggy looked desperately at the bull, waiting for some form of instructions as to what he should do next. From behind them, a tall figure was emerging out of the mist. The three turned around at the sound of the footsteps and stared up at this newcomer. She was tall, well, taller than any of them. Most adults were. She was dressed in baggy overalls and carried a large tin lunchbox in one hand. Her face was rough and covered in old cuts and bruises, but beneath the disfigurement they could tell that she was still relatively young. She did not break eye contact with the kids as she drew nearer, shifting her gaze from one to the other and back again. She did not stop until she was just a few feet in front of them. Then she too turned to face the decrepit mansion. Without looking back at them, she said, "It's 6 o'clock in the morning. Where are your parents?" At this, the bull snapped into a sort of knee-jerk reaction. He puffed out his chest and jabbed a thumb at himself, trying to look as big as possible as he said, "Parents? Like I need some know-it-all jerk telling me what I can or can't do all the time, just because he's bigger than me. I ain't got parents, and I'm glad of it." Twiggy looked admiringly at the bull as he said this, and hurried to mimic his exact pose and energy. "Yeah," he said in chorus, "I ain't got no parents neither, and I'm glad of it." He nodded his head sharply at these last words, then looked up at the bull for confirmation that he had said the right thing. The bull smiled out of the corner of his mouth, but did not stop looking at the woman in front of him. "I have parents," sounded Dorothy from behind the two, with slightly less confidence in her voice than before. "But they don't like Twiggy and Bull much, see? So I sneak out of the house to play with them. They have all sorts of adventures." The woman turned to look at them all again, and smiled slightly. "I could see that," she said, noticing the shards of broken glass littering the lawn and the sidewalk. The bull looked as if his confidence was returning to him, and he gave the woman a dirty look. "Listen, lady," he jeered at her. "We're kinda in the middle of something here, got it? We don't need any interference from some hoity-toity grown-up what thinks she knows everything." "You're just mad because she knows you're lying too," chimed in Dorothy, starting to spin her parasol again. "Go ahead, missus. You were saying that the window had been broken for a long time." The woman glanced at Dorothy with a look of curiosity on her face. "Oh, well, that's just what I've heard," she said, shrugging. "I don't have any proof, or anything like that." She gave a smug look towards the bull, who frowned at her. "Well, I do," Dorothy said, a note of impatience in her voice. "My daddy told me the whole story, see? Everyone at the bank knows it. In fact, I bet the only person in the whole city who doesn't know that this window was already broken is Twiggy, because he can't see up to the top floor." The bull tried his best not to look uncomfortable. Twiggy was looking from Dorothy to the bull to the woman and back, as if waiting for someone to explain to him what he should be thinking. Dorothy had stopped spinning her parasol. The woman was looking at her with intense eyes, and she had the feeling that her testimony was being silently challenged. Not wanting to look foolish, Dorothy cleared her throat, shook her head, and began speaking again. "You see, this house belonged to an old professor back in the day. He used to teach at Brown, see? Very respected member of the community. That's what my daddy says. Well, anyway, he was murdered by his housekeeper." Twiggy let out a gasp, and the bull raised an eyebrow. The woman standing behind them lowered her lunchbox to the ground and sat down at the curb so that she was about the same height as the rest of the kids. "Murdered by his housekeeper?" the woman asked Dorothy. "Why did they do that, I wonder?" Dorothy looked somewhat excited that she had so clearly captured the attention of everyone present, and continued, now twirling her parasol again. "Well, my daddy says that the professor left all of his money and his big mansion here to his housekeeper, Juno Mason, in his will. She found out about it, see, and she didn't want to wait for the old man to die. She wanted the house as soon as possible, so she killed him. That way she could claim inheritance to his entire estate, just like that." She snapped her fingers. "But they caught her, right?" interjected Twiggy, who was staring intensely at Dorothy, taking in every word with unwavering curiosity. "She went to jail, right? So she didn't get the house." "Well, no," said Dorothy. "No, the police weren't able to find any evidence that she had committed the murder. That's what my daddy said. The body was—" She stopped and shivered slightly. The woman watching her raised an eyebrow. "Well, anyway," Dorothy continued, "they could never prove that the housekeeper had killed the professor, see? So she got the house." Twiggy let out a comprehensive "ah," then whirled around suddenly. "So you're saying that the murderer is still living in there?" he asked, panic in his voice as he stared, shaking at the old house. "Don't be dumb," said the bull, who had too been listening to the story very carefully. "Obviously, this lady's been dead for years. All this happened long before we were born, probably even before Dot's dad was born. The housekeeper must have been like 100. 71, the woman said, still sitting on the curb of the sidewalk, not looking at the children. She's 71 now. "And she's not dead," added Dorothy. "My daddy knows her. He's trying to buy the house back, see? He says that the moment she got the inheritance from the professor, Mason locked up the house and put all the money away in a secure bank account. My daddy says that she doesn't deserve the house, and if she won't sell it to the bank, they'll do whatever they can to give it to someone who appreciates it." Dorothy stamped her foot, folding her parasol and pointing it menacingly at the bull. "But the point is," she continued, "that window has been broken since the day the cops found the professor's body. You didn't break it." She jabbed her folded parasol into the sidewalk, resting both her hands on the crook of the handle, and breathed heavily. Dorothy looked at the bull, a victorious smile spreading across her face. Then she froze. Her smile vanished, and she suddenly turned from him to stare at the woman sitting near them on the curb. A look of realization came over her face, and she pointed a shaking finger at the lunchbox next to the woman. "Is that your name on the lunchbox?" she asked, a tone of fear in her voice. The woman looked up, eyebrows raised, then stared down at her side. "Oh, yeah, that's me," she replied casually. The bull and Twiggy were now both squinting at the lunchbox, trying to distinguish the markings etched into the tin cover. "Psst," whispered the bull to Dorothy out of the corner of his mouth. "What's it say?" Dorothy stared open-mouthed at the box. Neatly carved into the red surface were the letters M-A-S-O-N. "Mason," she said, her voice shaking. "Your name is Mason?" The boys paused, taking a moment to comprehend what had just been revealed. Then Twiggy jumped back. "The murderer! She's the murderer housekeeper what killed the professor!" He fell to his knees, covering his head with his hands. "I ain't never threw a rock at your house, miss. Not me, no ma'am. Please don't do me like you did that old coot." He started sobbing, but the woman just stared at him, frowning. "You numbskull!" shouted the bull, kicking Twiggy in the side. "She's not 70 years old. This is clearly not Juno Mason," he said, looking at the woman with a hand outstretched. "She's clearly Her daughter. At this, the woman scowled at the kids and stood up abruptly. What? How old do you think I... Daughter? No, I'm... The woman looked both offended and confused, but struggled to regain her composure. In a much more level voice, she continued, I'm Juno Mason's granddaughter. My name is Celeste. Dorothy looked utterly terrified. The bull was sizing up Celeste, as if trying to decide whether or not he could handle her if she decided to attack. Twiggy peered up from in between his fingers, still huddled in a ball on the sidewalk. Celeste looked from one kid to another, her jaw clenched and her fist balled. After a few seconds, she relaxed and rubbed her eyes. This was almost an unconscious reaction. So many times she had been confronted about her grandmother and her connection to Professor Dorr. Nearly everyone she met was convinced of Juno's guilt, and it almost never mattered what Celeste said in her grandmother's defense. Over the years, the convictions of strangers had muddied her perception of the truth, and now these accusations served only to confuse and anger her further. But this, perhaps, was different. They were just kids, she told herself. There's no need to get so upset. She may even be able to change their minds. I didn't break the window, the bull said suddenly. They all stared at him, shocked at this confession. That's right. It's been broken like that for as long as I can remember. I just figured I might be able to convince Twiggy that I had done it, 'cause... He looked defeated at his comrade. Well, 'cause he's never noticed it was broken before. The bull hung his head in shame. His eyes kept darting back and forth towards Twiggy, waiting for his reaction to what he had just said. But Twiggy was now transfixed on Celeste. Your grandma is a murderer? Asked Twiggy, now getting to his feet. Celeste felt the wave of confusion and anger that accompanied questions like this wash over her again. No! She never killed that man. Professor Dorr was her friend, she said, somewhat more loudly than she had intended. Twiggy recoiled at this unexpected scolding and started fiddling with his hands again. Dorothy, on the other hand, was now examining Celeste from a distance, just as she had looked when she had first arrived in front of the house. My daddy said that Mason was only pretending to be friendly with him so that she could win over his favor. He says her plan all along was to get the money, see? Well, your daddy wasn't there, was he? Snapped Celeste, her temper rising again. The only person still alive today who witnessed the scene of the crime was my grandmother, and I trust her, not some stuck-up suit at a bank who was just after her money. She had forgotten to tone down her intensity for the children, but she was too riled up at this point for that to change. Now Dorothy was looking shaken too, and she took a step behind Twiggy, who was also inching away from Celeste. Only the bull stood directly in front of her, and he now looked up to meet her eyes. This is a big house, he said to her, somewhat indifferent to her apparent anger. Why don't you and your granny live here? Celeste blinked. Of all of the things people had asked her pertaining to her grandmother and this house, this had never been brought up. They usually focused on the murder, or how she had managed to avoid conviction, but never once had anyone inquired as to why neither Juno nor Celeste currently resided in the house that she had inherited. Celeste paused a moment, her mouth half open. She had memorized a lot of answers to the questions people had asked about the murder, about her grandma, about their family. But this, she did not know how to respond. I don't know, she said at last. You don't know? The bull repeated agitatedly. How could you not know? She's your grandma, ain't she? She never told you why she took the house but never lived in it? No, replied Celeste, her voice trailing off. Ain't she never lived in the house? Squeaked Twiggy, now a good 5 feet away from Celeste. No, never. From the day it was left in her name, she wouldn't let anyone inside. Not her husband, not her daughter, and not... She hesitated, looking longingly up at the house. Certainly not me. It was quiet now. The fog had started to lift as the morning sun rose higher in the sky. Leaves blew in the wind, swirling around the 4 people standing on the sidewalk and rustling as they skidded along the pavement. A loud steam whistle blew in the distance, and the 3 children jumped. Crap, whispered Celeste, and she scooped up her lunchbox off the ground. I gotta go, kids, she said to them, looking flustered. Don't throw any more rocks at this place, huh? She started past them along the sidewalk, not looking back. Dot, Twiggy, and the bull stared at her as she walked away. Have you ever asked her? Dorothy said, softly. Celeste froze in her tracks. She did not turn back to look at her, but stared dead ahead, She closed her eyes as the wind blew in her face. "Some questions aren't worth asking, kid," she responded, and her head drooped slightly. She looked over her shoulder and met Dorothy's eyes. "But your daddy is right about one thing." Dorothy raised her eyebrows, clutching her parasol in her hands. "Juno Mason doesn't deserve this place." And she walked away, disappearing round a corner and out of sight. Dot, Twiggy, and the bull stood rooted to the spot, staring at where the mysterious woman had just been. Sunlight started to flood into the street, and the leaves blowing from the trees around them fell gently as the wind died.